I asked the question by email to Steve Kilby and to Gareth Koch, and look, how did you guys get together? Well, look, thank you, Gareth, for organising this, because Gareth managed to put a recording for us, and we'll play that now from Gareth's own words. Here we go.
Hi, this is Gareth Koch here, a classical guitarist and composer, also songwriting partner with Steve Kilby. And just talking about how the partnership formed in the early days with Steve and I found myself, before I met Steve, writing a song. I'd been writing a few songs. But this particular one, I'll just play a bit of it actually, just how it all started on the guitar. So it went along something like this. And I thought to myself, gee, that sounds a bit like the Byrds, or no, it doesn't. It sounds like an early song by the Church. And I thought, oh, well, look, I'll just keep writing it anyway. So it evolved, and a melody was included. And it became the song called Lost at Sea, which is on our first album. But then was the tricky business of, well, how do I get Steve to actually sing this song, because clearly it's meant for him. And so I did what any normal person would do and just got in contact. And to my complete amazement, Steve said, yeah, look, I'll do this. And because the funny thing is, I come from a classical music background and have had a fairly long recording and performing career in that genre, but it's funny how the two worlds don't often collide. And Steve, of course, I've admired forever from his early work in the Church and beyond. And so that's how the partnership came into being. That's how we got together, simply through making some contact and through the music being there and creating something that was possible to work on. So yeah, that's how things began, just really with an innocuous chord progression. Something like that, which evolved into a song, and that was the first thing we ever recorded together.
Well, thank you, Gareth, because that's what he's just answered the question. How come an award-winning, and I'm going to tell you about the award later, an award-winning PhD classical guitarist with a string of classical albums out, recording and touring around the world, meets up with another legend in the rock contemporary music vein, and how they come together. And well, thanks, Gareth, for answering that question. Here's Gareth Koch talking about the songwriting aspect of their wonderful album, and of course, look, for all you scientists out there who can pronounce this properly, but Chryse Planitia is the new album from Steve and Gareth, and look, my pronunciation still might be a bit awkward on that, but look, here they are talking about songwriting.
So comments on songwriting. How does a song come into being? How do you create something out of nothing? And I really don't have the proper answer to that. I don't understand it myself. And perhaps this is part of the reason that the creative process is somehow shrouded in mystery. But sometimes there are little concrete things that make sense to me and perhaps to others. So for example, on the Chryse Planitia album, we have a track that we created called Ophelia, Without Wine. Now, this began as an idea based on a medieval French hymn. The melody goes something like this. Now, I didn't quite know what to do with that. I kept on fiddling with it, changing it, put it in a different key, for example. And then once that key change had happened, somehow the piece suggested more options. There was a resonance there that fired up some musical neurons, I guess you could call it, in my brain. And then I just devised this simple accompaniment which I felt might lift the tune and take it into a new direction. So you need to imagine that just as an underlay for this tune. Here's the accompaniment again. And once that had happened, as a musician you start to hear all the other parts before they're even written. So that's the bass and the bells and the chimes and the added guitars and the orchestra, which somehow is part of building the piece, and of course the vocals. That's a separate thing again, and that's where Steve creates the final magic of a song, or changes its direction and idea entirely. And so that's how one particular song might come into being. Let's look, say, at the opening track of Chryse Planitia, which began in the creative phase fairly innocuously with a sort of a blues country idea that is very far removed from what it actually became, but this was the core building block. And then I thought, well, that's interesting, but it's not really me, it's not really what I do. And I started fiddling with it, speeding it up. And then it began to sound more like the finished track that opens the album, called Fallen Crown. And once I'd got that part sort of secure and it had more of an identity, I started imagining big Keith Moon style drum parts, quite mad drum parts with lots of fills and creativity, and a choir that could sort of be part of the build of the song, and big Hammond keyboard, and of course then the vocal part, which Steve created out of nothing, and how he does that is a mystery to me. And then that's how that track, for example, came into being. So that's a type of insight into how, at least from the musical perspective, a song might come into being.
But I also sent an email and said, look, can you tell us a bit about how you went about recording the album? And Gareth, well, at very short notice, he only heard earlier today about this, and there I had it this afternoon, a recording of Gareth talking about, how he and Steve went about recording this wonderful album.
Comments on recording. Well, a lot of the tracks for the Chryse Planitia album began very humbly in my little home studio, where I sit now in relative isolation, or complete isolation, at this most unusual time in the world's history. But so from a little home studio, of course, files can be shared and taken to other locations, which was part of the evolution of the album, and we did end up in the final phase at a very fine and venerable studio called Damien Gerard Studios, now located actually in West Gosford, having been previously in Balmain, a studio with a long and interesting trajectory. But so a home studio is not a bad place to start, of course, because there's time and there's space and there's the ability for ideas to evolve and or be rejected, as the case may be. So if we look at a track like Thylacine, for example, off the album, I was looking at a particular chord on the guitar which I've had a long association with, because it is a chord that's very closely associated with flamenco music. And this particular chord has this ambience and sound to it. And this is a very dour and somehow dark sounding chord, and it formed the basis idea for the Thylacine track, which of course is a song that is tinged with sadness because of this extinction of this incredibly wonderful creature. And so this chord somehow was going to be the signature sound of the Thylacine. And so a rhythm was generated out of this chord. Became the idea for the Thylacine track, which in its final version, of course, found its way to the big studio, Damien Gerard's studio, where other instruments were layered on. And even though this particular release is the work of myself and Steve, there have been so many contributors along the way, and they're all acknowledged, of course, on the liner notes. But on the Thylacine track, for example, there are no fewer than 2 didgeridoos, and guitars all played by me, and of course Steve's vocal part. Drums, for example, most of which are played by a sensational young drummer by the name of Dane Leonard, based in my home state of Tasmania. And of course, other collaborators on an album like this includes engineers, the people who mix the albums and eventually master the albums, and all those names are acknowledged, and we're very grateful to all those people. So the recording process is very interesting. It can start very humbly and then evolves into a bigger phase of production.
The Alive 90.5 Australian Spectrum Show with Ross Fear at 9 p.m. every Tuesday night has a featured studio guest who is currently performing on the Sydney music scene. Tune in to hear some wonderful new music, new album launches, news on up-and-coming festivals, and news of when some of our studio guests are performing around town. That's every Tuesday night at 9 p.m. on Alive 90.5.